100th time since I regained it, I reach into the pouch and I touch the sand. I sift it through my fingers. I feel each grain of it, inexhaustible, endless, like myself, like the few others of my kind.
Hey, welcome back to Cards and Comics, and hope you enjoyed that intro. That is from Audible's Sandman Act 1. That is now free on Audible. I'm not being paid by them. I just love the content, and today's video was inspired by me listening to the Audible presentation of Sandman, and Neil Gaiman is he's the narrator, so it's got a lot of great actresses and actors. So if you want to check it out, it's great. And like, for example, right now it's free, right? Um, but you got James McAvoy, Kate Denning, just to Andy Serkis. So there's a lot of great actors and voice talent in this. But today's video was focused on that when I got to the sixth chapter, which is called 24 Hours. And it really affected me because I didn't realize just how dark and horrific issue 6 of Sandman was. As a teenager reading this, and the fact that if you look at the actual panels in the comic book, it doesn't really affect you as much as hearing the people go through this nightmare and torture that this issue puts them through. But it also, with the Netflix show coming out, it's going to be very difficult to portray this because there's so much going on in this issue. And I've titled this video "The Most Horrific Comic Book Ever," and I think it is because of the level of horror that this issue goes through, and it's just the multi layers that happens in this book is hard to explain unless you've read it. But when you hear it, it gets even more real on how awful the things that happen to these characters. So before I start into the issue, because I am going to show you the panels and kind of go through some of the issues, is there was an interview in 2017 from Entertainment Weekly, of all places, with Neil Gaiman in it, and basically they had Neil Gaiman made the scariest horror comic of all time. So that's sort of after I listened to the episode, I kind of want to do some research of like, how did this comic book evolve, and how come when you talk about horror comics, that Sandman isn't considered one of the best horror comics of all time, let alone it's considered one of the best stories of all time, but not just for horror alone. And the fact that I believe it is the most horrific comic book ever written, and especially in modern times, something from the last 30, 40 years, it is by far the most horrific comic book written in that time period. Now, this article is really good, and it touches upon the fact that okay, this book came out in 1989, and the story is called 24 Hours, right? And if you go into what he's saying, basically he's saying in the first paragraph that that he still hadn't found his voice yet. He was still trying to figure out how to create this story and tell it in a way that he really wanted. And he says, I wanted to sail the horror ship as far as I could go. And I wanted to get things, kind of under your skin, and that this was dangerous, that this book and what's happening to these people is dangerous. So I think he really accomplished that point. And, they talk about that, so some of the things that happen in this book is there's torture, there's forced intercourse, there is necrophilia, there is, cannibalism, there is eye horror. And it mentions specifically, and I think it's very important, two things here is that, that there's a lot of classic horror comics being regurgitated by Gaiman in this story, that things that he read as a kid comes out of these pages, right? So if you look at the character design of Dr. Destiny, he definitely is an homage to classic Golden Age villain. So Dr. Destiny is the villain in the book. He's insane, and I don't want to get too involved in the story because in Sandman, all the characters have this sort of interrelation at multiple levels. So obviously, there's prior characters that set up Dr. Destiny, namely his mom. Um, but in the character design, which I'll show you here, and this is the cover, and there's a really good shot of him in one of the panels right here, where you can kind of see his design, how he looks more like a skull, and there's an actual even better shot of him where he literally, yeah, right here, he looks like a skull. He doesn't look like a human, right? Then if you go into CBSI, had the top horror covers of all time, and you look at Horrific Comics #1, and you just see, like, yes, he looks a lot like that character there. And then if you go up to, like, in the very beginning, Weird Tales, Captain America, Red Skull, how he was portrayed in a horror comic, very similar, but you just see all the skull motifs, and melted faces, that was part of, Golden Age horror. And the other motif that was very common was eye damage, and in fact, the most classic eye damage book in horror is shown here. And if you scroll down, you'll see it. And it's Mystery, Mr. Mystery 12. You have eye damage, and then and a lot of time in these horror comics, the actual horrific thing doesn't occur. Whereas in Sandman, the eye injuries are real and happen. So going back to what Neil Gaiman says here, the other thing that he talks about is, that he had just seen a movie called Drowning by Numbers, in which, they count down, and over the course of the story, 3 women drown their husbands, and and he had the idea of counting down 24 hours and increasing the depravity inside the diner, right? Now, he says that he knew exactly how he wanted to write the story, and that he was inspired by the movie that he just saw, which is a pretty big art house film. If you kind of go over here to this Wikipedia, you'll find, it's by Peter Greenaway. It came out in '88. And that's really important too, because it came out in '88. Now, one of the other motifs that happens in this book, it talks about it in the story, is necrophilia. And so, if you go into the story of Karen Greenlee, which was a necrophiliac, they had an article published in 1987 in a very famous book called Apocalypse Culture. So that came out in '87. The Drowning by Numbers came out in '88. You can see, how Gaiman's taking current pop culture, that's kind of his culture, and kind of the underground, pop culture that's coming out, and mirroring it up with classic 50s and 40s horror to make his, story, right? And, so I think it's just a really interesting way that he created this story. Now, the thing that is very difficult when you get to the story itself, though, is, what all happened. So, if you go through the story, and why I think it's some of the most horrific is, for one thing, it sets up the characters. Like, these aren't just slasher victims, right? This isn't just like him killing off a bunch of just people that are randomly in a restaurant, because it's set up in a diner, okay? And the first character you meet, is Betty, who's a writer, and she's recording all these stories of these characters that she's, that she meets in the as a waitress, right? And she's basically really kind of like judging and kind of in her mind writing their history, like if they have a bad story, she kind of changes it so they're happy, right? She wants everyone to have a happy ending, right? And that's kind of her character. You meet Judy, and she is a lesbian. So let's say it right up the fact, and she's got a rude girl pin, which I think is so 90s, or late 80s, early 90s. That Neil was very quick to introduce transgender homosexual characters into stories, and she actually comes out and her and she's actually in a, let's say, a bad relationship, and the character that actually is her girlfriend is Foxglove, who's in a later arc. So you see how everything's interrelated in Sandman, which is really awesome as a story arc. But if you read, what he says, what Betty says about Judy is, what those girls do is a sin against God and a natural, right? And so he is kind of setting up that this is early, this is late 80s, 89. It was not a safe place for homosexuals yet. And I think it was great for him to point out that, even if, you've got characters who accept a person, they don't condone what the person does. And that was very, very much in the late 80s. And, I do enjoy the Joy Division. Neil is such a, late 70s, 80s kind of guy. And then you meet other characters. You meet a married couple here. The character designs are definitely designed to give you an idea. One of them is a fat cat, like a consumer, ism kind of guy. And then you meet his wife, and as you go through the story, you kind of get introduced to all of these, in Marsh, and it's kind of like a normal. Everyone's in this, in this diner. You meet this younger guy here who, I forget his name. He basically is getting ready for a job interview. So everything's very normal. Then you find out later that when Dr. Destiny comes into the diner here, he says they aren't customers; they're raw material, and so he's going to have fun, basically, torturing these people for the next 24 hours. And that's, basically the premise of the whole story. And if you get down to it, and he's got this magic ruby, that he stole from, or was stolen from Dream, that allows him to manipulate reality. So, as you go through the story, as things start to kind of happen, here's a good example of, a fight with, Judy and her girlfriend, Donna, who becomes Foxglove in a later story. You start seeing, very, which I call like the RoboCop. You see ads for different things. You see TV. You just see different things. That are pop culture related, and as the story gets more horrific, the first thing that he does is he's watching TV, and so he makes the character on TV, which is a kid show, slit his own wrist. So first horrific thing that happens in the story is on live TV, he has a kid's character slit his own wrist, and and he says, and remember, slash down the wrist of boys and girls, not across. Okay. Then he starts laughing, uncontrollably, right? Because he thinks it's really funny because he's, controlling reality. This is like the first thing that happens is a kid's character on TV in front of a live audience kills or slashes his own wrist, right? I actually think later on you find out he's actually not dead. And then he keeps making them want to stay. So that some people, they end up trying to leave. And so you get down to some of the. He then goes into their dreams and finds out what they all want to be. They want to be successful. And Gary, the husband and wife duo, he's thinking about money and hookers and and then his wife, Kate, she's really upset about, him having all these affairs. So she imagines, cutting off his head. Like, this is the dream. So her happy dream is cutting off the head of her husband, which I think is one of the reasons why, uh, Drowning by Numbers, the movie, kind of what his inspiration is. He was abusive. He was cheating on her, and she wanted to kill him. But you know, it's interesting how she's looking at him lovingly after she's killed him. Um, you know, Betty wants to be a famous writer, and you know, as you find out, the world's kind of starting to have these nightmares. But I mean, this is just like the little things in the story. Hour nine, they start beating up, the lesbian girl, and saying things that some people think, and it's pretty horrific. And then there's a part where they start carrying him around like he's their god. They're cheering him. One of the characters cuts off his own finger, and Dr. D actually licks it because it's a tribute. I mean, it's just and then because think about it, like this is on a page, and some things happen off page here, which is how they probably got away with some of this. But some things happen on page, but when you listen to it and you hear a guy cutting off his finger, live is just not, it's just not, a pleasant experience. And then that's just like a small part of all the crazy stuff. And then here's where it really got, just off the charts. Here is, they get to know each other better. So Kate, Gary's wife, confesses that when she was, younger and in college, she got drunk and found herself in a funeral home and had sex with a corpse. And then she says that after that, that's all she wanted to do, and so like she's became obsessed with having sex with dead bodies, and so like this is a DC comic. Okay, you saw like Constantine and Batman's these stories, and this is not the kind of comic you would expect out of DC in the early '90s. Here is where they have a mass orgy. Obviously, nothing is on screen. So yeah, I mean it. And the thing that's even like just crazy is, in the background he's got the Addams family. And the only thing Dr. Destiny says is neat. It's just really, really, just crazy horrific. And then he turns him into the three fates. And if you read Gaiman or Sandman, the three fates come out like in multiple story arcs, and they tell him different versions of his future. And at the very end, he tortures and kills them. Right? They kills one of them in the dark. Here is just another example of confessions, and penance, where Marsh talks about being in jail and finding out that Betty's son had been in jail, and Betty's son was a prostitute for men, and he had paid him in jail. I mean, and while he's doing that, she's driving nails into his hand. I mean, I don't know how more brutal and crazy you can get, but then it gets crazier and more brutal, right? Here is where Gary and the other guy, Mark, I think is his name, they go crazy and fight over the other women, and then Gary ends up like ripping his throat out and killing him and eating part of his body. So again, it gets just crazier and crazier, and eventually it leads up to this panel, which is the classic eye damage panel where she takes two pokers and pokes her eyes out, and at the end of the day, everyone's finally dead. You can just see different, here where Kate's literally, dead on top of a dead body. Obviously, what she was doing. There's somebody's head cut off. I mean, it's just horrific, right? There's the two pokers sticking out of Judy's eyes. It's just brutal, right? And finally, Sandman shows up, and then they go into a final, panel where there's going to be kind of a reckoning. Now So all that crazy stuff has just happened, right? And you know, you've got Dream asking him like, do you being challenged that he's not even strong enough at this point to even take out Doctor Destiny. So now the resolution to this, and so again, this is I'll put there's spoilers all over this because I'm reviewing this and kind of giving you the idea of why it's so horrific, and why this is probably the most important modern horror comic book, is that the next chapter doesn't set everything back to normal. Everyone's still dead. What happens to the world, which as part of this happening, at the same time that this is happening, he's causing planes to wreck, people to have nightmares, killing each other. Like it's like mass chaos in the world. People are thinking the world's ending, all because of Dr. Destiny and his power to manipulate their minds and dreams. And Dream doesn't reset any of that. He puts him back in Arkham Asylum and doesn't even kill him. Like basically, Dr. Destiny says, "I'm sorry for what I did," and he puts him back, and then Dream even helps him sleep. And so it's like, wow, like he gets no penalties for doing any of this. He doesn't die. He does nothing gets reset. Nobody comes back to life. It is literally, a line in the sand saying there is brutal stuff happening and it's all happening. This isn't like, because you're talking about the Dream Lord, so you could just say it was all a dream, and everyone would have been like, "Oh, well, okay, well, he is Sandman, okay, I can, everything's a dream, and every story could have resolved with it's just a dream, right?" And nothing like that happens. It doesn't resolve into just a dream. This is real. It's brutal, and the effects of this story happen, affect other stories, and so and that's how the story, this whole the Sandman is, it kind of leads into the next arc. And so what happens to Judy affects Foxglove, okay? And that's, and so as you go into different arcs, what happens in this book affects others, and that's great, and that's why it's such a good story, and that's why Neil was a great writer, okay? And you can't argue that there was anything that he was doing that wasn't great, but I will say that listening to this Audible version of it was very, very hard. It's hard to hear the things that happen in this book, in audio. And to see it live on Netflix is going to be really interesting for me. I don't know how they're going to pull this off. I just don't know if they can go this far. It's just so brutal and it's so hard to listen to. So I just don't know. And is it going to be treated like a horror comic or a horror TV series? Is it going to be like, oh, here's a comic book series, Sandman, look at these cool characters, kind of gothy, and then 6 episodes in, people are like puking because this is so horrible, right? I don't know. I'm really interested in seeing how they do it. But Neil has said, in interviews about the TV show, is that it's basically a direct translation, so they got to go for it. Now, at the very end is, how is this comic book selling? Well, if you go on eBay, 9.8 just sold for $275, and just to give you an idea, most non first appearance Sandman books sell, for $100 or less at a 9.8. They're not, and so nothing key happens in this book. In terms of first appearances, there's no first appearances, every that matter, nothing key happens except for the story, and you can see that they're coming off the shelf, so this is like virtually, $19-20, with shipping. So, and I was at the comic book show, Terrificon in Connecticut, and I bought 2 copies, and one was 14 and one was 20 at the show. So people are recognizing that this version of this story is, very dark and very important to the whole series. And I think as this, here's one that sold for $20 plus $31 shipping. So this sold for like $50. total cost to the consumer. Um, I think that is where, here's one that sold for $35. Okay. And then this is what I love about eBay. Like, this guy sold one for $375. I'm not sure how that happens. Right above at 35, $375. But in general, I know this book is really taking off, right? So, it's definitely one of those Sandman books that you find in runs that people haven't pulled. So I just bought a collection of Vertigo books from a friend who collected them when she was in high school and college, and it's the entire collection. And this book wasn't pulled, but 1 and 8 were pulled, right? And so it's like, okay, well, most collections of Sandman, the 1 and 8 are gone, no matter when you buy them, right? But 6 will still be there, and in later collections, 1, 4, 8, 10, 22, all the major first appearances are gone. First Daniel, first Lucifer, first Sandman, first Death, first Corinthian. They're all going to be gone, and so it's interesting that you can still find a 6. And so I'd encourage people to go out into your stores that have Sandman books and see how many 6s you can find. And obviously getting it graded, if you can find it for $10, eventually you get it graded, if the grading ever comes back, you have a good shot at making some good money on this book. I think it's going to keep going up because, it's not a key first appearance. However, it is a great story, and it is the most horrific comic book that's been made in the last 40 years and maybe ever. And I do think, in my opinion, it's the most horrific one I've ever read. I don't know any EC or Golden Age comic book that had something that's consistently as horrible as what happens in this book, that doesn't get retconned or ends, with it being a dream or something. So again, this book's out there. It's in the wild. You can find it. I found 2 copies for $35 at a local show. So that's like $17.50 a piece. That's still pretty good. I imagine you can go to an LCS and find it, right? If you got one local, if they carry some Sandman books. This one probably has been pulled. So there it is, the most horrific comic book in modern times, Sandman number 6. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.